All right, what's happening, fish freaks? So today I'm going to go over the tank, just some updates that I've made, and then we're going to talk about the no water change type method as far as low-tech tanks go, the Diana Wallstead type technique, and then we're going to talk about the water change method and even a third option, and I'm going to discuss the pros and cons of each, and I'm going to give you my opinion on which one I believe mimics nature more accurately, and it's more of a hybrid technique. And of course, this is also based on my own experience as an actual environmental scientist, as a researcher, doing surface hydrology, doing point and non-point source phosphorus pollution entering lakes, mapping tributaries, inflows, all that kind of thing around specific lakes, and actual real world experience, as well as reference studies. So anyway, let's go ahead and just get a close-up of the tank, and I'll tell you a little bit about the updates that I've made and then some of the surprises that I found out. I was totally off, so let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so you may have already noticed that there's a dwarf emerald rasbora in the aquarium. I ended up getting 5. One sparkling gourami jumped out of the tank, and then another one I found dead. And so, lesson learned. I have been out of the hobby for about 4 years, and so I am making some mistakes. And I'm definitely going to be getting a bigger aquarium. I'm going to be upgrading this to a 24-gallon. And so as of now, I have 1 sparkling gourami, 5 dwarf emerald rasboras, which are just super awesome. They're kind of shy, but I've always wanted to own these fish, and they're really cool looking and everything like that. And so I'm going to go ahead and, of course, get a bigger aquarium. And then I got 2 big female fire red shrimp. And then to add to the mix, I got 5 red ram's horn snells. Some of them are brown, but a few of them are a little more red coloration. Excuse me. So the one thing I want to talk about is I thought that this plant, when I purchased it, was my Chrysanthemum Monte Carlo, but I guess I read the tissue culture wrong. It's actually my Chrysanthemum micranthomoides, which is just AKA pearlweed. And what's great about pearlweed is it easily pearls. Like, I don't know if that's why they call it that, but out of all the plants, the pearlweed pearls like crazy, not just after water change, but just at any given time. And so I would say that pearlweed is probably one of the easiest plants to grow out of all plants that I've taken care of. It's extremely easy to grow. Probably pearlweed and then Java moss. As well, I'm keeping this tank very soft, so I have about 150 parts per million TDS, if you're someone who likes to measure TDS. High TDS isn't always necessarily bad. It depends on if it's the organic fraction and if you're testing carbonates and phosphates. So again, carbonates and phosphates can impede plant growth. Same with hydroxyl ions. And then even sometimes if you have too much potassium, that can even hinder other nutrients. But the big issue with TDS is usually the organic fraction, which is the dissolved organic carbon. If you have a lot of organic carbon and stuff, if your tank isn't well aged, of course it can lead to some algae issues, but dissolved organic carbon does tend to balance out over time. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that with the no water change method versus the water change method. And so what I like to do, of course, is I measure KH, which is the carbonate hardness. It gives you a rough estimate of other buffering agents in the water, such as phosphates. And so if you have a low KH, usually you're also going to have a low inorganic TDS fraction as far as the phosphates go. It's not always necessarily bad to have TDS in the aquarium because you are dosing with liquid fertilizers, or you may be. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. So yeah, the tank's working out really well. The Ludwigia, I guess it's the triple red, is looking even more red. So the new growth that's coming up is looking really nice and red. The Rotala bossi has this nice pink coloration. It's a really delicate plant. And sometimes it'll get a little bit of algae down here, but I'm telling you, every night I have pond snails go through and they go back and forth, and they clean all the algae off these leaves. I did notice a little bit of a fuzz algae outbreak after I added the root tabs. And so I'm thinking maybe the root tabs were the cause for the algae. The little dwarf Amazon sword. So this isn't the Amazon micro chain sword. So this isn't chain sword. This is, I want to say it's called Zwangenescence or Zwangensis, I think is what it is. It's a Mandarin scientific type name. But anyway, you can call it basically the dwarf Amazon sword. It's looking a little bit better. Some of the shoots in the middle that are coming up are more dark green in the middle of the shoot, which is a good sign, which I believe it must be tapping into the root tabs. I did put several root tabs over here, and then I put several over there. But anyway, yeah, I'm really happy with the growth of the pearlweed and the whole tank. I do plan on moving a lot of this into a 24-gallon, and then we'll see if I'll do something else with this tank. Maybe I'll turn this into just a shrimp tank, like maybe keep the rocks in here and just do a bunch of pearlweed and add some moss. Maybe I'll get some more moss, or I'll get some more plants such as moss and Monte Carlo, and I'll just have a bunch of moss, Monte Carlo, and pearlweed with a bunch of shrimp. But I'm going to move most all of this to a bigger tank. Anyway, let me go ahead and get back in front of the camera. We're going to talk about the no water changes versus water changes and a possible third option, the hybrid option. So let's go ahead and do that right now. Okay, so as far as the no water changes versus water changes, I think that there's some misconceptions in the hobby as far as what is closer to mimicking nature. And so what I was getting at earlier with the dissolved organic carbon is that, of course, over time it can balance, the microbial beds are going to balance your input. So essentially, whatever kind of condition or environment you create for your plants, fish, and microbes, they're going to acclimate to that environment. However, that doesn't mean that the environment is the optimized environment, and it also doesn't mean that it's the environment that's closest to mimicking nature. So as far as the no water changes aquariums go, which I've done in the past, you can go months and months without doing water changes. You can use a soil substrate, which I'm an advocate of. You can put extra cellulose or different kelp powders in the substrate for slow release nutrients as well as slow release carbon. You can add a little bit of clay or even, volcanic ash for higher cation exchange capacity, those types of things. But what I've found is that doing water changes, having higher surface agitation, and also having higher flow overall is usually, within most environments, going to create healthier plant growth. And the reason being, and this is actually found in nature, is plants tend to grow in high flow areas with high surface agitation in the same water body versus in another area of the water body. So the water body that has the lowest flow and the lowest surface agitation and more stagnant water has the least amount of plant mass. And the area that has the most surface agitation and the highest flow has the highest plant mass. And people may advocate for, well, the plants produce oxygen, so because they're producing oxygen, therefore you don't need to have a lot of flow or a lot of surface agitation. But the thing is, surface agitation and high flow areas produce more plants. Therefore, those areas have more dissolved oxygen because of the plants and because of the surface agitation, which is more beneficial for the microbial fauna. Because in our aquarium, we don't really get anaerobic conditions. You might get very, very small pockets of anaerobic or anoxic conditions in the center of your media or in very, very deep substrates, but it's very uncommon and it's not the norm. Our systems are actually very aerobic, so you want to optimize that situation. So what I've found with my own personal experience, and then of course even with reference studies, is that the reason plants grow in a high flow area with high surface agitation is it's a physical mechanism. So a plant shoot will pop up, and with higher flow, the plant shoot actually stops colloidal particles in the water column and causes them to drop to the substrate, lowering the turbidity, which then increases the amount of light. As well as that area already has more dissolved oxygen. So when the turbidity and the dissolved solids drop to the substrate, there's healthier microbial beds to then decompose the turbidity that's falling out of the water column, whether it's organic or inorganic, to the substrate. And it's a feedback loop. It's a positive feedback loop. It's a snowball effect. Where the plants pop up, the flow allows them to mitigate the colloidal particles and the turbidity, increasing the amount of available light. When plants pop up in an area that has low flow and low surface agitation, they're at a disadvantage. They may pop up, but they're not necessarily going to last. And the flow also brings nutrients in proximity to the plant leaves. And of course, aquatic plants can take up nutrients from their roots as well as their leaves. And so the whole idea of flow, it's bringing in more carbon, which can be in the form of bicarbonate or carbonic acid. And of course, the plants prefer carbonic acid. It's bringing in more nutrients in close proximity to the biofilm that's on the plant leaves. Because a lot of these plants assimilate the nutrients on their leaves because of the biofilm that's growing on their leaves. This is another reason why areas with high biomass of plants have lower algae. It's not necessarily the plants outcompeting the algae, because that's a misnomer. It's actually that the plants have more surface area, which creates more of an area for the biofilm to grow, and then the biofilm helps decompose the organic matter into inorganic matter, and it also helps to collect the inorganic minerals in the actual polysaccharide biofilm that it creates, keeping those in close proximity to the plants. So as you can see, there's a lot of different things that go into it. You may need to watch this video a few times. I know I'm just kind of going off the top of my head, but I've talked about these things in the past. I've talked about this so many times. I've researched it so many times. I've actually done it as part of my schooling, as part of my career. I'm even forgetting things right now that I need to say as a part of this, because there's a lot that goes into it. And so essentially, you just want to provide the plants with what's actually mimicking nature. So let me get to that. Dosing liquid fertilizers isn't necessarily mimicking nature as close as having a good substrate system. And so I do agree with having the good soil substrates. Specific types of soils are better than others. And so usually it's soil with volcanic ash, which is an andesol soil, which aqua soil, if it's from Japan and different areas, so happens to actually be an andesol soil. So an andesol soil is the most, you could say, effective and efficient type of soil in the world. And that's what a really, really good aqua soil is made out of. Amazon version 2 isn't that. I'm pretty sure I heard rumors that their original source, they ran out. The Amazonia, ADA Amazonia version 2 is really just contra soil. It's more of a clay base. It has a lot less humus, a lot less compost. That's why they're sending those little fertilizer pellets with your bag, because the new aqua soil is not the same as the old. And I remember the old. The old had a lot more like lignite, like glues and gums. It was really, really sticky, had a lot of humus, had a lot of humic acid, had a lot of fulvic acid. It was totally different than the Amazonia 2. The Amazonia 2 is basically a higher clay concentration, and that's why they're giving you those mineralized root tabs, because you actually have to have partially decomposed organic matter in the substrate to then mineralize, to then add more nutrients to the system. If it's mostly clay-based with a lower organic fraction, then there's going to be less constituents that can be mineralized. So I know I'm kind of going all over the place with this, but what I'm getting at is what mimics nature is having a really good substrate system that's sustainable and not necessarily dosing liquid fertilizers. And also what mimics nature is having high flow, having high surface agitation, and doing water changes. Because in a tributary, there's a high water volume turnover rate per minute, per second. It's not stagnant. Stagnant water isn't mimicking nature. Doing water changes is mimicking nature. Having high surface agitation is mimicking nature, and I've talked about the gas exchange flux in the past. And basically, if you have a faster flux, like a faster gas exchange, it's actually more stable. And if you're not dosing CO2, you're always going to be at about 3 to 4 parts per million of partial pressure of atmospheric CO2 in the aquarium, even if you have high surface agitation. That's the whole misnomer. Like, having high surface agitation may let more CO2 go out of your aquarium that you're either pumping in, or if you're using cellulose in your substrate and kelp powder to kind of work together synergistically to create substrate CO2, you're going to have a higher differential of CO2 in the water now because you're creating it from the substrate. If you increase your surface agitation, that of course can increase the flux and allow more CO2 escape, which then would allow you to pump more CO2 into that volume if you're using pressurized CO2. But if you're not using pressurized CO2, then I can see why, if you're making substrate-based CO2 with cellulose pellets and kelp powder, that you may want a higher concentration of CO2 in the aquarium with a lower surface agitation. But if you're not relying on a lot of substrate CO2, which may or may not even be that necessary, if you're just relying on the atmospheric CO2, having a higher surface agitation isn't going to reduce the CO2 that's in the water. It's actually going to just stabilize the flux, and it's going to increase the dissolved oxygen. And so my whole point is, what I found is, it seems as if having a low KH, a low carbonate hardness, right, doing water changes, having surface agitation, those types of things, high flow, they outweigh the idea of having a lot of substrate CO2, low surface agitation, low flow, and no water changes. Now, if you were to combine them together, then that would be the best of both worlds, and that's the hybrid approach. So my point is, you can have a really nice soil substrate. You could even add like volcanic ash-based clays and organic compost pellets or kelp powder or even little sawdust cellulose pellets. You could add all those things in a capsule to your substrate, or you could just use really good aqua soil such as Tropica. I'm convinced Tropica is better than the new Amazonia version 2. So you can do all that and have a really great substrate system, and then you can do water changes. You can have higher flow and higher surface agitation, which is going to create the water column stability. So you have the stability in the substrate, and then you have the stability in the water column. And a filter, may or may not be necessary. The filter is the thing that may not be as necessary if you have a really good substrate system that may have some vermiculite or lava rubble in there. But of course, the filtration in the planted aquarium acts more as mechanical filtration, because the microbes decompose everything and then the plants take up the residual ammonia or ammonium. Our filters aren't really working that well at lower pHs. At a 6 pH or below, the aerobic bacteria don't really work anyhow. So in a planted aquarium, the filter is really more about mechanical filtration and about adding that flow. But if you had a really good substrate system that has good aeration, you had good stability in the water, you could just add like a Coralia wave maker, right? You could just add a power head and add some flow and add some circulation. So one more thing. I know I'm kind of all over the place on this. I don't script these videos. I just want to get this out there and let you guys think about it for a minute, and you can, watch the video and rewind certain parts to try and make sense of all of what I'm saying. What I want to add to this when it pertains to a low KH carbonate hardness, and also certain plants being able to use bicarbonate, such as hard water plants, and then the atmospheric CO2, I want to relate all these things together, and it's this. Essentially, when people say, well, some hard water plants can use bicarbonates for their carbon source, that's true, but their CO2 compensation point is at about 9 pH. Most people aren't running a 9 pH aquarium unless you have Tanganyika cichlids, right? So the plants will start utilizing the bicarbonate at a 9 pH. So the point is, if you have really hard water with a high bicarbonate buffer, when the atmospheric CO2 does come into the water and it turns into bicarbonate, or carbonic acid, excuse me, it then does buffer as bicarbonate, because that's what the bicarbonate buffer is going to do. So there's less available CO2 in the water column, even in a low-tech aquarium, if you have a high bicarbonate buffer. So my point is, hard water plants have a better chance of growing in soft water than soft water plants have a chance of growing in hard water. Okay, most hard water plants can grow in soft water because you're going to have more available carbonic acid and you're going to have more available nutrients. So the point is, if you lower that KH and you get that carbonate down to 2 to 3 DKH, which is about 50 to 90 parts per million, we could just say 50 to 100 parts per million. Some of the aquascapers even advocate for only a 0.5 DKH. I don't think you need to be that extreme for most plants or for most people. Maybe if you're growing blood vomit or different, extremely hard to grow plants. So my point is, you could aim for a 1 to 3, but I feel like it's a little safer just to do 2 to 3 for shrimp and snails and those types of things. And I swear, back in the day, I read a study where they studied a bunch of different plants and they found out that 3 DKH was the optimum amount of bicarbonate for a lot of plants, because if you have too much bicarbonate, then they can't utilize the nutrients, and then if you don't have enough bicarbonate, then it just seems like there's something, it affects the plant growth in a way, and of course it's not as stable. I could be wrong, I could be misremembering. It just, for some reason, they found that having around a 3 DKH seemed to be the most optimal level for the plant growth and for CO2 availability, because everything's always a curve. It's usually not linear, it's usually not straight across, it's usually some type of bell curve. And so something about not having enough bicarbonate also impedes the plant growth. It could be that, the bicarbonate actually helps a little bit with nutrient transport, things like that, or something with stability when it comes to the microbes. They actually need a little bit. They utilize some of the carbonate in a way. Maybe it's the microbes doing it. Anyway, the point is, 2 to 3 DKH seems to be a really great value for the plant growth and also keeping the fish and the shrimp and the snails alive. Now, of course, if you have specific demands for something such as discus, or you're trying to breed Apistogramma cockatoides, cockatoo cichlids, or if you're keeping Tanganyika cichlids, obviously it's a totally different story. I'm talking about the general planted aquarium and the general type of fauna and flora that most of us are keeping. As well, most of us aren't planning on running an aquarium for 7 or 10 years or even 5 years. So a lot of the whole no water change, you don't need flow, you don't need surface agitation, don't do any water changes, I don't have to change my substrate for 5 years. I'm not saying that doesn't work. It actually does work. The system can balance itself over time, but it's not really applicable to most hobbyists, and it's not really necessary, and it's not actually mimicking nature, and it's not the most optimized environment. Most hobbyists, they want to change their scape at least, every 24 months. Most people, after about 24 months, even 12 months, they kind of may get sick of their scape and they may want to rescape. So to conclude everything, because I know this is pretty crazy and I just kind of did it on the fly, do the hybrid system. Have a really good substrate system, have high flow, have high surface agitation, do water changes, and then if you want to add that flow and get rid of some of your mechanical waste, of course, add a hang-on back filter or a canister filter. If you're not going to have a filter, then you're probably going to want to have more of a cleanup crew. You're going to want to have a substrate that has a lot of aeration, so all the cleanup crew and the microbial fauna can go ahead and decompose all that detritus and all the dissolved organic carbon if you decide not to go with a filter. But if you decide not to go with a filter, I would still advocate for flow and for surface agitation. So that's, basically my rant, I guess you could say. I could probably go on and on about all kinds of different things, but that is mimicking nature more than dosing liquid fertilizers, more than even pressurized CO2 in a way, and I'll talk a little bit about that here in a second, and more than not having flow and not doing water changes. Because a lot of the people that do no water changes, they don't have a lot of flow and stuff like that, they're adding liquid fertilizers because maybe their substrate isn't adequate enough. Well, if you get an adequate enough substrate, you don't really need to add a lot of fertilizers. Over time, of course, you more than likely will need to add root tabs. Even in this scape, I had to add root tabs. So it's not really just a matter of opinion and preference. It's actually a matter of the outcome. So let me talk a little bit about saying, hey, well, pressurized CO2, that's not mimicking nature. Again, that depends on the environment. A lot of environments only have about 3 to 4 parts per million CO2. But in certain areas in South America and different tributaries and different lakes, they can actually have up to 20 parts per million CO2 naturally because of aquifers underneath the ground. There's decomposition going on underneath the ground. Underneath the lake, it can actually create methane gas, and then when the methane rises and oxidizes, it becomes CO2. There can be a lot of decomposing organic matter in the substrate adjacent to the fish and to the plants, and as the microbes break all of that down, as the biofilm and the fungi and the microbes and the protozoan and all that kind of stuff break it all down, they're obviously releasing CO2 in the process. And so some areas with a lot of high organic decomposition from dissolved organic carbon, they're going to have higher CO2. And this is why certain fish from certain areas can tolerate higher CO2 than other fish, like I've talked about in previous videos. So this video, you could say, is actually kind of just a rundown of all the methodologies, what we see in the hobby versus what we see in nature, and how we're trying to satisfy and mimic nature and satisfy both environments within just a little glass box. So I guess I could call this basically the science of aquariums. It's the reason everyone's always, from their perspective, they want to say their perspective's right and this perspective may be wrong, is because they all hold truth. They all hold truth. So what you can do is you can find the best truths or the most efficient or effective truths from each perspective and combine them together. So I guess you could even just call this the holistic optimized approach. I won't say the holistic approach because holistic approach a lot of times implies anecdotal evidence. I'll say the holistic optimized scientific approach. So it's kind of you're combining the holistic gardening with the science. And so if you take all the truths from all the different perspectives and you add them together, you're going to end up with the optimized method. And you can even see it with the plant growth in my aquarium. I had super hard water, super high TDS, super high KH, everything like that. And what did I do? I lowered my KH way down. It is at roughly 2.5 to 3 DKH. So I am sitting at about 80 parts per million, which is 3 DKH. And my TDS is at about 150 parts per million for total TDS, which is considered soft water. And just by doing that, my plants have had, a miraculous recovery, essentially. And I'm not relying heavily on substrate CO2. I'm just relying on the 3 to 4 parts per million of CO2 coming from the atmosphere, which is actually enough if you're creating that stable environment. So that's the other argument for the high gas exchange and the high surface agitation, is because you're creating a stable gas flux. So I'm always having a stable amount of CO2 coming from the atmosphere. And because I have that low KH, the CO2 is in an available form. It's in carbonic acid form and gaseous CO2. It's not in bicarbonate form, which is a lot easier for all plants to take up because, again, hard water plants don't even utilize bicarbonate as their carbon source until they meet their carbon compensation point, which for most plants averages at a 9 pH. So plants that can be grown in Lake Tanganyika or Lake Malawi, things like that, you can put those into a Tanganyika setup, but most any other plants are not going to do well. So anyway, I'm done. I'm done ranting. I know this video was super crazy. A lot of people may not have the attention span for it. So I just want you to watch it over and over and over and pick up some ideas from it. And, you know, hopefully it can help you with some of your blind spots and some of your misconceptions about nature and about the hobby. So again, this is the optimized, holistic, scientific approach to the planted aquarium. Until next time, keep your sleeves wet. Peace out.